The lights of the Capitol studio bathed the set in a cold white glow. Cameras hummed softly as producers barked last-minute instructions through earpieces. A large LED screen behind the two podiums displayed the title, Global Power and Responsibility, America and the World. But no one was really here to talk policy. Everyone came for the clash. On one side of the stage stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, confident, stylish, and sharp-tongued. She had made a name for herself by dominating cable news debates and putting foreign leaders in their place. Tonight would be no different, at least that's what she believed. On the other side stood Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. Composed and almost too calm, he adjusted the cuffs of his modest brown suit. No flag pin, no entourage. Just him, his voice, and a quiet kind of power that made even the most seasoned producers take notice. For many in the room, he was a mystery. For Jasmine, he was a target. The host welcomed the live audience. Applause rang out, but it quickly died when Jasmine leaned toward her mic with a rehearsed smile and said, "President Traoré, welcome. I'm sure it's interesting for you to be in a room like this." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded. Jasmine pressed on. "I mean, let's be honest, this isn't Ouagadougou. This is Washington. Big leagues." The jab was subtle, sarcastic, and wrapped in that signature American confidence. Some in the audience chuckled. Others raised eyebrows. Traoré finally leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're right, Representative Crockett. This is not Ouagadougou. And that's exactly why I came. Because rooms like this need different voices, voices that don't echo the same beliefs, generation after generation." His words didn't raise his voice, they lowered the room. Jasmine blinked. Not because she was offended, but because something about his tone, not angry, not defensive, threw her off rhythm. "Let's talk about global responsibility," the host interjected, trying to steer things forward. But the atmosphere had already changed. This wasn't going to be another talking point tennis match. It was going to be something else. And Traoré had just served the first unreturnable shot. Jasmine Crockett leaned against her podium, crossing one arm over the other. Her smile returned, but it was tighter this time, her pride just a touch bruised. She wasn't used to guests who deflected jabs with grace instead of anger. That wasn't how the game was usually played. "So, President Traoré," she said, adopting a mock-curious tone, "you speak often about Africa's independence, but isn't it a bit hypocritical to sit here and lecture Americans while accepting billions in aid and infrastructure support from us?" A low murmur swept the audience. Traoré didn't flinch. He took a slow breath, folding his hands on the podium. "You misunderstand the nature of aid," he replied. "Real help lifts people up. But conditional aid? That's leverage. And I didn't come here to accept lectures masked as charity." Jasmine interrupted, "Well, then perhaps you should stop showing up on Western television. You want the benefits, but none of the humility." A few gasps. A few quiet claps. She thought she'd cornered him. Traoré stepped forward slightly, his voice unwavering. "Humility is knowing your place in the world, not assuming it is always at the top. I came to this stage not for benefits, Representative. I came to confront the arrogance that believes only certain nations get to define civilized or responsible." Now the studio was silent. The crowd wasn't sure who to root for anymore. Crockett wasn't done. She tilted her head and smirked, "You're passionate. But passion doesn't build economies. You talk like a revolutionary. But we build, we lead." Traoré allowed a pause, intentional, surgical. "I'm not here to lead your country. I'm here to stop yours from leading mine." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it hit the room like a cannon shot. Even the host was speechless. Crockett looked away for a second, blinking hard. Her smile had vanished. In a single sentence, Traoré had reframed the entire debate, not as one between equals, but as one between a self-anointed empire and a man refusing to bow. And Jasmine Crockett had just realized she was no longer playing with a guest. She was standing across from something much harder to dismiss: conviction. Backstage, producers scrambled. The show had been marketed as a diplomatic exchange, not a battle of ideologies. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't following the script, and Jasmine Crockett, once the queen of on-air control, was clearly rattled. Ratings were soaring. Viewers across the country were glued to their screens, unsure whether they were watching a debate or a dismantling. The host tried to pivot. "Let's move to trade. Representative Crockett, your view on resource partnerships with developing nations?" Jasmine straightened her blazer, regaining her edge. "Look, we believe in fair trade. But when nations start nationalizing industries and turning away from Western companies, that's not fairness, that's isolation." She turned toward Traoré. "And let's be honest. If it weren't for American corporations, how much of your infrastructure would even exist?" It was the old playbook, the implied debt, the invisible strings. Traoré smiled softly. Not the kind of smile that showed amusement. The kind that held memory. Patience. Fire. "Let me tell you a story," he began. 2 years ago, a village in the northern region of Burkina Faso had no electricity. No running water. No road. Western aid said the terrain was too rough, the population too small. So we built it ourselves, with local hands and local tools. No loans. No logos. Just will. He paused, letting the silence hang like smoke. Then came the American engineers, weeks later. They arrived to help only after the work was done. Then they held a press conference, as if they had laid the stones themselves. Gasps from the audience. Jasmine flinched, just slightly. "We don't reject partnership," Traoré said. "But we reject being paraded as a success story when the success was never yours to begin with." Crockett chuckled, trying to recover. "That's a compelling anecdote, Mr. President. But America doesn't need to take credit for your small wins." "No," he replied evenly. "But it seems America has a habit of doing just that." A beat of silence. Even viewers at home could feel it, the tectonic plates of power, shifting under every word. Jasmine Crockett was no longer simply debating a foreign president. She was clashing with a worldview that didn't need her approval. And for the first time in her on-air career, she couldn't tell if she was winning. Jasmine Crockett sat still for a moment, her usual rhythm faltering. She wasn't used to this kind of resistance, not from foreign leaders, and certainly not on live television. Her next words came slower, more deliberate. "So what exactly do you want from America, Mr. Traoré?" she asked. "Do you want us out of Africa entirely? No aid, no trade, no collaboration? Just a clean break?" Her tone carried a mix of skepticism and challenge. She expected Traoré to backpedal, maybe soften his stance. But he didn't. "I want something simple," he said, his voice firm. "I want your country to stop believing that we are something you can manage." Crockett blinked. "I want the world to understand," he continued, "that Africa is not an unfinished project waiting for a Western blueprint. It is a continent with its own architects. And we are done being told where the bricks go." The audience was dead quiet. "No one ever asked us where the borders should be drawn," he added, his gaze sharp. "No one ever asked what language we wanted to speak, or which flag we would prefer to salute. Everything was assigned, by countries who never meant to stay, but refused to truly leave." Crockett, sensing the shift in tone, tried to reframe the conversation. "I think you're romanticizing sovereignty. There are realities here: economic interdependence, global security, regional stability. You can't just walk away from that." Traoré nodded. You're right. We can't walk away. But we can walk differently. And we can choose whose hand we don't need to hold. He stepped slightly forward, not with aggression, but authority. I'm not here to beg for respect. I'm here to remind you that we never asked for your permission to exist. Crockett's lips parted, as if to interrupt, but she didn't. It was a moment rarely seen on American television, a foreign voice not pleading, not apologizing, but declaring. With clarity. With pride. And somewhere, behind the cameras, a young producer whispered, this wasn't supposed to go like this. But it was. Because this wasn't just politics anymore, it was history, finally speaking back. Realizing she was losing ground, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her approach. She stood, hands animated, voice rising. It was a classic move. When logic falters, volume becomes the armor. You say you want dignity, Mr. Traoré, but what about human rights? What about the journalists imprisoned under your government? What about the critics silenced? You talk a lot about Western arrogance, maybe you should talk about your own. She had found a wedge, or thought she had. But Traoré remained seated. Still. Focused. I expected that line, he said calmly. It always comes when a black nation begins to assert control over its own affairs. Crockett furrowed her brow. Let me be clear, Traoré continued. I do not fear criticism. I welcome accountability. But I do not welcome lectures from nations whose hands are still stained with the blood of stolen continents. Gasps from the back rows. One of the producers briefly motioned to cut to commercial, but the director shook his head. Ratings were spiking. You imprisoned children on the southern border, Traoré said. You bombed weddings from the sky in the name of security. You allowed corporations to exploit nations for cobalt, gold, oil, then turned around and asked us to apologize for resisting. He leaned forward now, voice low but piercing. Don't confuse your discomfort with moral high ground. Jasmine's face tightened, but she said nothing. Traoré wasn't yelling. He wasn't even emotional. And yet the force of his words felt heavier than any insult. You call it silencing when your narrative is no longer the only one in the room, he added. But I call it balance finally returning to the table. In that moment, the audience shifted. Not just physically, they leaned forward. Emotionally. They weren't watching two politicians anymore. They were witnessing a turning point. Jasmine tried one more swing. So are we the enemy now? America? Traoré shook his head. No, he said quietly. But sometimes, friends need to be reminded where the line is. There was a moment of silence, thick, electric, after Traoré's last words. It was Jasmine Crockett who finally broke it, but not with her voice. With a chuckle. A short, sharp laugh. You really think this will play well back home, don't you? She said, brushing a stray hair from her face. That you're some kind of revolutionary truth-teller on American soil. But let me remind you, this is my country. And in my country, we ask the questions. Traoré tilted his head slightly, his smile faint. In your country, he said, questions are often answers wearing a disguise. But I'll humor you. Ask. She leaned in, sensing a chance to regain control. What exactly do you want from us, Mr. Traoré? You say you don't need our aid. You say our alliances are manipulative. You paint America as the villain in every scene. So what do you want? Traoré didn't hesitate. Respect, he said. Not as a favor. As a fact. Jasmine scoffed. He continued. I want your institutions to stop pretending that we are students in a classroom you built. I want your media to stop cropping Africa out of the global conversation unless there's a war, a famine, or a photo op. I want your politicians to stop arriving in our capitals with smiles and leaving with resources. And then, a slow, unexpected sound. Applause. Not loud. Not unanimous. But from the back rows of the audience, international students, journalists, even a few off-duty diplomats. People who weren't supposed to clap. But they did. Crockett's expression froze. Her control of the room had slipped again. "Do you hear that?" Traoré asked quietly, turning slightly toward the sound. She straightened her spine. "That's not America clapping." "No," Traoré agreed. "That's the world, recognizing that the silence they once mistook for submission was just breath, being held. Waiting to be released." Jasmine leaned back, arms crossed, unsure what to say next. Not because she had run out of words, but because she had run out of weight. Her words weren't landing anymore. His were. Backstage, the control room was in chaos. Producers whispered over each other, unsure whether they were witnessing a career-ending ambush or the most riveting political exchange of the year. The viewership numbers were skyrocketing, but so was the risk. On stage, though, Traoré remained utterly still. Jasmine Crockett, visibly unsettled now, reached for the oldest trick in the political playbook, the flag. "You speak of dignity, Mr. Traoré, and I respect that," she said. "But you forget, this flag," she pointed to the small U.S. flag pin on her lapel, "has meant freedom for billions. It stood against tyranny. It fed nations when they were starving. Including yours." Traoré didn't flinch. He looked at the pin. Then looked back at her. "I don't forget," he said softly. "I remember everything. Including the food that came with strings. The medicine that came with conditions. The soldiers that came without invitation." The crowd was dead silent. "I do not speak against the American people," Traoré continued. "I speak against the myth that power equals righteousness. That aid equals loyalty. That history has only one author." A camera slowly zoomed in on his face, not angry, not defiant. Focused. Unapologetic. "You fed nations," he said. "But only those who played by your rules. You stood against tyranny, except when it wore your uniform. And you offered freedom, as long as it came branded." He paused. "You don't get to wear the flag and the blindfold at the same time." That line hit harder than expected. Even Jasmine flinched. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was dissection. Careful. Precise. Irrefutable. "I'm not here to lecture," Traoré said. "But if you claim to be a friend of democracy, then act like one. Respect the choice of other nations, even when they don't choose you." And for the first time since the debate began, Jasmine Crockett had no comeback. No snark. No spin. Nothing. Because he hadn't attacked her. He had simply shown her the mirror. Jasmine adjusted her mic slightly, stalling. Her practiced confidence was still there, but something had cracked. The rhythm had shifted, and she could feel it. So she did what every sharp politician does when the ground trembles, she leaned into nationalism. "Mr. Traoré," she said, standing taller, her voice regaining its fire. "You come to this stage, this country, and you criticize us, while enjoying the safety, the reach, the global spotlight we provide. That's what America does. We build the platforms. We build the stages. And frankly, without us, I doubt you'd be here." It was meant to be a knockout line. A round-ending jab that brought the audience to its feet. But they didn't rise. Traoré didn't react at first. He looked down briefly, almost as if disappointed, not by her words, but by their predictability. Then he looked up. And said the quiet part out loud. "I'm here," he replied, "because of what my people built, not what your people allowed." Jasmine blinked. "I'm here," he repeated, "because we survived the very platforms that were built to contain us. I stand on this stage not because you gave me space, but because we carved it out of the silence you left us in. He took a step forward. My presence isn't proof of your generosity. It's proof of our persistence. That line hung in the air like a cathedral bell. You see a room. I see a world watching. You play to the crowd. I speak to the future. Even those who weren't fans of Traoré were now silent in thought. The audience was no longer an audience, it had become a witness. Crockett looked around and saw it. The momentum wasn't hers anymore. And it wasn't about the room. It was about what that room represented, and who had finally stood up in it without asking permission. A long, loaded pause gripped the room. No one clapped. No one jeered. The studio audience, the moderators, even the staff behind the cameras, all frozen. It wasn't fear. It was awe. Traoré didn't grandstand. He didn't grin. He didn't even look like he'd won. He just stood there, calm and still, like a man who had delivered truth and had no need to dress it up. Jasmine Crockett glanced sideways, searching for an anchor, a laugh, a nod, a whisper from the moderator. None came. So she pivoted. You speak of the future, she said, forcing composure back into her voice. But the future still needs order. Structure. Security. That's what America brings. That's what I fight for. Traoré nodded respectfully. Order, yes. But not control. Structure, not shackles. Security, but not surveillance. Then he walked across the stage, not aggressively, but deliberately, and extended his hand. Let me show you what we fight for. He pulled a folded photo from his coat pocket. It showed a school in rural Burkina Faso, solar panels on the roof, children laughing outside, and a banner that read, "We plant our own future." This school was built with no loans. No foreign contractors. No external debt. Just people, land, labor, and vision. He handed her the photo. That is our revolution, he said. Not against you. But for us. Jasmine took the photo, quietly. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time that night, she wasn't debating. She was listening. And the audience was watching not just two opponents, but two worldviews. One built on maintaining influence. The other built on outgrowing it. At home, millions of viewers, American, African, global, felt the shift. They tweeted, posted, debated. But one phrase trended above all. One man spoke. The room changed. Because that's exactly what happened. By the time the debate ended, the room had a different temperature. Crockett gave her closing remarks. They were polished, patriotic, and well-framed, but something was missing. Not because she hadn't prepared. Not because she lacked conviction. But because the air had shifted. When it was Traoré's turn, he didn't thank the moderators. He didn't reiterate talking points. He didn't try to charm the crowd. Instead, he said, "Power is not measured by how many nations salute you. It's measured by how many rise alongside you." He paused, scanning the room, and beyond it, the cameras, the millions watching. America can lead, yes. But leadership is not louder microphones. It's listening. It's letting others speak. It's understanding that the world doesn't orbit a single flag anymore. He finished with this. I did not come here to win a debate. I came here to change one. And he had. As the outro music played and credits rolled, producers whispered frantically, they'd never seen an audience sit in silence like that. Social media exploded. Hashtags ranged from hashtag Traoré effect to hashtag Burkina voice to even hashtag Jasmine rethinks. The next morning, international headlines read, African leader stuns America on live TV. Traoré redefines what power looks like. Crockett faced fire, but Traoré lit it. Behind closed doors, some U.S. officials criticized Traoré. Others, quietly admired him. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't hold a grudge. In fact, a week later, she requested a private meeting. Not for damage control. For understanding. Because something in her had shifted too. Sometimes, the most powerful words are not shouted, they're simply spoken with conviction. And when a voice from the margin echoes through the heart of power, the world listens. Ibrahim Traoré didn't argue for victory. He argued for vision. And in doing so, he didn't just silence a room, he opened a new conversation.